Nguyen Cao Ky, hereafter Marshal Ky, is, to the surprise of many North Vietnamese. He was born and educated at Hanoi, to be sure, when the area was a French province. He was educated as a flyer by the French and served in action with the French, and spent 6 months at the U.S. Air Command and Staff College at Maxwell Field in Alabama. In 1965, he became Premier of South Vietnam, and for a period of about a year, he was the fighting symbol of South Vietnamese resistance to the communist invasion from the north. 10 years later, he was a refugee at Camp Pendleton, California. In between, he stepped down from Premier to Vice President under Marshal Thieu. There grew slowly and to a certain extent impenetrably a mutual hostility between the two military leaders. And finally, in 1971, Marshal Ky withdrew from the race for the presidency. His withdrawal had the effect of leaving Thieu as a single candidate, greatly discrediting the election and encouraging the critics of South Vietnam, who suddenly cultivated a great interest in Indo-Chinese democracy. By the time the Great Rout came in the spring of 1975, Marshal Ky, to the American reader, appeared to have become almost incoherent. Late in April, he was quoted as saying the North Vietnamese deserved to win given the scale of the corruption in the South. Later, he was heard to say that he would stay and fight until the end, and that any South Vietnamese who left the battlefront was something of a traitor. And a few days after that, he was safely aboard an American vessel bound for Guam. Now he and his family are in the United States, and he is planning to write a book called 20 Years and 20 Days, 1955 to 1975. It is one of the purposes of this exchange to inquire what he will put into that book. I should like to begin by saying that as far as I am concerned, I encourage Marshal Ky to say exactly what is on his mind, but I am constrained to ask whether he feels he is under any inhibitions in view of the fact that he is residing in America as an alien.
Well, you asked my opinion about America?
Well, I will in due course, but I asked you something rather more specific, which was whether you feel that you have to speak less than frankly in the light of the fact that you are the citizen of a foreign country residing in America. I hope you don't, but if you do, I want you to say so that people can apply that warning in interpreting your responses.
Well, you know that I'm first a fighter pilot and a military man. I came to politics by accident, through a very special situation of my country. I came to politics and become premier during the most troubled period of the South Vietnam. So I mean, basically, I'm not a politician. So I'm a military. So I used to be frank to myself and very frank to other people. Since I've been here 4 months now, the press and the people around America I realized that they were interested to talk with me and to know what happened during the last 10 years, 15 years, what happened in Vietnam, what the cause of the failure. And most of the time I try to be very frank with them and give them a better knowledge about war in Vietnam.
Well, does being frank with them entitle you to be critical of American political leaders? In other words,
I think yes, but well, that's the reason why until now, even that I said I'm very frank, and I try to be very frank, but not 100%, because I don't want to see Vietnam become a new controversial issue.
A new what?
Controversial issue. When we arrived here, we fully aware that for the last few years, war in Vietnam was not popular, and Vietnam War was a controversial issue which divided American people. So now, as the war was over, and what I am interested now is the destiny, the future of 160,000 refugees from Vietnam. And I don't think it's useful. I don't think that I can help them effectively if by some way we make the Vietnam become a new controversial issue.
Well, Marshal Ky, you were invited here to discuss, quotes, why the Vietnamese War was lost. Now, I'm very much in favor of helping the refugees, but this program is not a program that is built for the purpose of raising money for refugees or discussing where they should go. It is a program designed to probe controversial issues. And you are one of the two best-known survivors of that war. And although we all know that you were a military man primarily, an ace, a very brave soldier, we also know that you were premier of your country and vice president, so that you were necessarily involved in politics during crucial years, and you have made a great many political statements. Now, are you willing to discuss those statements?
Yes.
Well, suppose we begin with the statement that you made on the 24th of April, in which you said that Thieu and his people were so corrupt, now this you made in Guam actually, and so incapable, it is not the fault of the U.S. Congress or the brave Vietnamese soldiers that we were vanquished. Now, is that a correct statement, or is that something you said in the flush of that bitterness?
No, it's true, and it was not the first time in Guam that I made such a statement. You remember, for the last 2 years before the end, I and many other anti-communist South Vietnamese, both military and civilian, particularly after the one-man show election, presidential election 1971. And we stood up and took a very strong position against the corrupted regime of Mr. Thieu. And in many occasions, when I met with American officials in Saigon or people who came from the United States, we make known our position. So one statement was not the first. In other words, I am not waiting until the failure, the collapse, to express my point of view.
Well, if you felt that it was inevitable that South Vietnam was going to lose because of the corruption of Thieu, why didn't you leave the country? Why didn't you come to the United States, as you did on one occasion, and say, stop giving us aid, it's not going to do any good unless we replace Thieu? Why did you wait until it was all over?
Well, I didn't wait until the end. But as I just mentioned, in many occasions, when I talked with the Vietnamese as well as with the American officials, I said that we need help from America, but how not to use the aid effectively in the fight against the communists. We need a big change within the South Vietnamese system and leaders. In other words, we need a very effective, clean, honest leadership in South Vietnam.
Well, now, what exactly would a clean, honest leadership have done to resist Soviet tanks that finally came down during March and April in 1975?
Well, the other side have had Soviet tanks, some missile, MiG-21, but in our side, they have a T-34 tanks. We had M48.
Yeah.
As good as theirs. They have 130 millimeters big gun. We have 175. I'm not trying to please the American congressman, because I'm not involved in any way in politics in this country. But I must be just and frank. I don't think that because we are in shock ammunitions or armament that we fell. It's purely military leadership.
Well, it is true, is it not, that the rate of the replacement of your weapons and of your heavy tanks and airplanes began to fall in the summer of 1974, whereas the other side was boosting its supply routes and in fact replenishing its military at an even exaggerated rate, in contradiction to Article 7 and 11 of the Paris Peace Accord. That's correct, isn't it?
It's true that at the end, 1970, at the late 74 and 75, the balance of our folks, we are really in a very disadvantaged military situation, because the attitude of American Congress, because the trouble and the problem, the difficulty is that the President of America had with the Congress. It's no doubt. But as mentioned earlier, early 73, 74, we already took position against Mr. Thieu ineffective leadership. And I think if at that time we had some chance, in other words, to provide South Vietnam a strong, popular and effective leadership, both civilian and military, boost the morale of the troops, and show to the American people a few good actions in the military field. I think if we took all those correction to show a better image of a South Vietnam government and military forces, and I think we can change the attitude of American Congress. In other words, get more and better equipment to continue the fight.
Let me see if I understand you. If I understand you, you're saying that if in 1973 and 1974 you had changed the political leadership in Saigon, it would have had the effect of lubricating the support from Congress. What makes you think so? And are you suggesting that that change in American attitude might have been brought about by your own ascendancy to the presidency? Thieu wasn't all that popular with Congress, but I think you were much more unpopular. This is just my general impressionistic reading.
I'm not talking about myself.
You're talking about who? Who would have been the logical leader to have taken over in 1973? My impression was that Graham Martin asked you to take over, did he not?
Well, they asked me about just 2 weeks before the end.
Yes, and Thieu refused to remove himself.
Yes, well, he finally resigned, but with his delaying tactics as usual, it took us to 2 more weeks. It's too late.
Who did you have in mind who was sort of a hero of American Congress?
Well,
who might have taken power in 1973?
At that time, I discussed that problem with many other, Vietnamese groups, politicians as well as military, and we all agreed. We thought that a one-man show is not good for Vietnam, and it's very difficult to find really a hero, a national hero at that time to replace Mr. Thieu. So I proposed to all of them what we can do if change it happens.
He was a hero to you?
No.
Well, I thought you said to find a hero to replace Mr. Thieu.
Yeah.
Or you mean to find somebody who was a hero?
Yeah.
To replace Mr. Thieu who was not a hero?
Yes.
Well, the North Vietnamese had no trouble with one-man rule, did they?
Yeah.
Ho Chi Minh was perfectly satisfactory.
Well,
as a one-man ruler.
But in the past, but after Ho Chi Minh died, you see, at that time, the foreign press speculate about if Ho Chi Minh died, then the communists in North Vietnam will have a trouble concerning leadership. But I said no, because with the system, the Politburo, of 9 or 10 men, they continue to govern very effectively. That's what we thought when we believed that the change of Mr. Thieu is necessity. I talked with the Vietnamese, and we believe that some sort of a committee of leadership will be an effective way to replace Mr. Thieu, one-man regime.
And how late do you think that would have been effective? In the summer of 73?
Yes.
Or as late as 74
yes.
even?
73, 74.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there was not a hero who could himself have directed the war effort, in your judgment? Not one man?
No.
Not somebody like Jem?
No, I agree.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now,
that's why we think about some sort of collective leadership, both in the government and in the military channel.
Yeah. Well, if the morale in South Vietnam was so low, how do you account for the extraordinary mortality in the armed forces? That is to say, the casualty figures were 10, 15 times as high per capita as they were in, say, France or the lowlands when they capitulated to Hitler. So it certainly suggests, if you add to that the refugee figures, that whatever they thought about local leadership, they were united in their opposition to the aggressors. Is that correct?
Oh, yes. And that's why, again, about my statement in Guam, I never tried to blame on the soldiers of the Vietnamese armed forces. Even the morale is low, but they still fight, and they are willing to accept sacrifices if we can provide them a good military leadership. And that's what all the troops who withdrew from Da Nang and Highland came to my home and expressed their opinion.
Well, do you distinguish between good military leadership and corruption? I mean, you can have very good military leader and also corruption, can't you?
Yes, but unfortunately, it's not happened in South Vietnam. What happened is most of the corrupt general officers are at the same time not good military leader.
Now, when you said while you were premier that under no circumstances would you negotiate with the Viet Cong because, quotes, they were murderers and criminals, did you mean to say that no one should negotiate with them, or just you in 1965 and 66 should not?
Well, when I said there's no way to negotiate or to talk with the communists, because with our past experience, we know them. If they are in a strong position, they will never accept negotiation. If they are in a weak position, of course they are not honest in accepting negotiation with you. So when they accept negotiation, it means that they're going to win. You know, in the mind of European people, when you talk about negotiation, you think about the mutual concession of both sides. But that is not the communist, particularly Asian and North Vietnamese communist opinion.
Well, why didn't you denounce the Paris Peace Accord then, since that was an apparent result of a negotiation?
I'm always against the Paris negotiation. I'm always against the Accord of Paris, because you remember right after the Accord of Paris, I gave to Newsweek magazine a long interview, and in that I already said that the Treaty of Paris very difficult to be implemented, because everything in that treaty was just vague. One. Second, with that accord, American gained something, withdraw in honor, serving face. The communist North Vietnamese got many things. So the only people who really lose everything are the nationally South Vietnamese.
Well, do you consider it a part of the defective leadership of President Thieu that he signed that treaty, or do you feel that he had no alternative than to sign it given the kind of pressure he was under?
I think Mr. Thieu and later on his vice president, Mr. Huang, admit that they had to sign it under very strong pressure.
If you had been president, would you have signed it?
No.
Would it have made any difference that you had a private letter from the President of the United States guaranteeing to enforce the treaty in the event of a transgression by the North?
Well, Mr. Thieu received that kind of guarantee from Mr. Nixon. But if I am the president of South Vietnam, I will not just rely on, informal guarantee from other government.
What would you have considered a formal guarantee?
Well, for example, the newest accord between Egyptian and Israel, for example, they weren't closed. Why
is that formal? It hasn't been passed by Congress. Congress hasn't even authorized the 200-man mission.
No, you try to get me involving the internal affairs of...
No. I'm just asking what it is that would constitute a formal guarantee in the circumstances of January '73.
Well, okay, I hope that if the Congress of America will vote and accept that
congressional resolution.
Yeah.
Well, were you aware that Mr. Nixon had given this guarantee to Thieu? Did he tell you in January of '73? Did you know about the existence of the letter?
No.
You didn't?
No.
Well, would it have relieved your anxieties if you had known about it?
No, I don't think it will make any difference in my feeling.
Well, do you think it was corrupt of Mr. Nixon to give the impression that he was himself in a position to back up that guarantee when, in fact, he was not?
Well, I think, we Asian, we believe, most of the time, we believe what a president of the biggest country, America, promised to us. Because what happened in the past proved that anytime a president of America promised us something, they will keep their words. But now, in the case of Mr. Nixon, we're fully aware of his situation, particularly after Watergate, and his prestige is no more higher than before. So I think without Watergate, maybe Mr. Nixon can keep his promise.
I see. So you feel that it was given in good faith and accepted by Mr. Thieu in good faith because he had no reason to know any more than anybody else did that Mr. Nixon's prestige would have evaporated in the ensuing period.
Yes.
Well, under those circumstances then, would you say that Mr. Thieu was justified in signing the peace accords given his reliance on the guarantee by Nixon?
Well, as I said earlier, Mr. Thieu...
But you said you denounced them earlier because you didn't know about the guarantee, you said. When you spoke to Newsweek, you didn't know about the guarantee, but didn't the guarantee substantially affect the...
Well, what I say, I didn't know because I didn't actually see the letters. But we're fully aware about that because, for internal public opinion, before he signed it, Mr. Thieu fully aware that it was not popular. So he just passed the word around that, well, don't be afraid. We had that guarantee from President Nixon, so we knew about it. Because he asked me about the letter, I didn't see it.
When you talk about the demoralization of the South Vietnamese people and their resultant incompetence in warding off the aggression, why is it that the aggressors were not themselves incompetent, since they had something much more to be feared than corruption back home? They had tyranny, totalitarianism, total lack of any freedom, lack of any ownership of land, the same kind of conditions that caused so many Vietnamese to flee the North in 1954, 5, and 6. Why did they behave in an exemplary way while the South Vietnamese, I take it from you, crumbled?
Well, that is the difference between communism and so-called freedom, free country. Now, you can be unhappy both sides, under communist or under a free but corrupted regime. I think the people both sides have the same feeling, but in our sight, and that is the weakness. If people are unhappy, and then they still have, even under a very, heavily censorship regime, but they still have the opportunities to express their opinion, whether they are happy or unhappy. But with the communist, it's totally different. Whether you're happy or you want it or not, you have to go to the war. And it happened, and I saw by myself when we destroyed some North Vietnamese tank, and we found North Vietnamese soldiers dead, of course, but with a chain tie his leg to the tank, so he had no choice.
So, in other words, the fact that they were required to fight accounts for their relative efficiency, as opposed to the relative inefficiency of the South Vietnamese, who if they deserted, were not treated as harshly.
Yes, I think when you talk about the difference of morale and will and motivation between the North Vietnamese and the South Vietnamese soldiers, it's more, I think it's purely the military matters. In other words, military discipline and military esprit de corps instead of, ideology.
To what extent was your esprit de corps damaged by the refusal of the United States to permit you to cut the Ho Chi Minh Trail or to attempt an invasion of the North?
Well, not much in the sense of esprit de corps. In the works, you know what esprit de corps means. But I think the majority of the military men, even a junior one, agree with me and many others, senior military men, that the best way to knock them down or to stop the aggression is to go north, blockade the Haiphong and mining, Hak Bo, and so on and so on. Because we, right at the beginning, we believe that a war with a limitation and a war with no win policy, at the end we'll lose that war, there's no doubt.
Corruption or no corruption?
Well, if we have a clean, honest, and effective government, maybe we can temporarily stop their advance for 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. But as long as North Vietnam is a safe area, with the 30 million people more than South. In South we have only about 14 to 15 million Vietnamese. So you can imagine with North Vietnamese as a safe base. And North Vietnamese can use safely and freely Laos and Cambodia. In the long run, if we can stop the advance temporarily for 1 month, 2 months, 1 year, at the end we're going to lose anyway.
Do I understand from one of the statements that you made in Saigon shortly before leaving that all along you subscribed to the notion that Americans ought never to have sent troops to Vietnam? Let me quote what came through on the Associated Press. You were quoted as saying, "Let the cowards who are leaving with the Americans go, and let those who love South Vietnam stay and fight. Why run? To do what? To eat leftover American food? Even if the country falls to the communists, at least they have yellow skins like ours." Now was rather a strange thing to hear from you, because it seemed to to underwrite a criticism of our presence in South Vietnam made by a great many Americans who felt that the difference in our ethnic background was the principally resisted and resented element among the people of Vietnam. Is that true?
Well, I said it about 2 months before the end. Exactly right after the attack on Ban Me Thuot city in the highland. And then with Mr. Thieu's decision to withdraw troops from Pleiku, Kon Tum, the whole highland. So there was a panic situation in Saigon. And American officials in Vietnam add to that kind of panic by providing plane for the evacuation of the Vietnamese and the families and people who work with the various American agencies. And of course, the rich Vietnamese, even official working with the government, and other rich people were profiteers. So the benefit of those, plane to get out. And some of them have to buy their passport, $5,000, $10,000. So when I and other people saw that...
From corrupt Americans this time.
Well, I mean, from both American and Vietnamese.
Mm-hmm.
So when we saw that kind of debacle happen, particularly the young military and the hardcore anti-communists, the Catholic, for example, the Hoa Hao, for example, they all come to me and asked me to do something to save the situation. They asked me to go around, to talk with the people, try to keep their morale, encourage them to stay and fight. Because if we could not stop the enemy outside of Saigon, in Nha Trang area or Da Nang, and then there will be no political solution with them. So I decide to take my time and go around and talk with the people. So you must know
that you were under pressure.
Yeah.
You were under great pressure. But you nevertheless chose to say something which you thought they would like to hear. Am I correct? That even if the communists took over, at least they would be conquered by people with yellow skins. Were you suggesting that there was ever a fear that people with white skins, Americans, desired in fact to colonize?
No, it's never happened to my mind that the Americans are coming to Vietnam as colonialists or something like that. In fact, 70, when I was here, I had already a big argument with the Senator Fulbright at that time about the presence of American in Vietnam and so on. So I think not only you, but all American people know where I stand for. But in such difficult and delicate situation where everything are ready to fall apart, when both the civilian and the military are in desperate, hope, no guidance, because the Prime Minister resigned, Mr. Thieu also was ready to go. So the average people need someone to tell them to something very strong so they can so they will believe and
remobilize.
Yes, a new motivation.
Mr. Jeff Greenfield is the author and freelance writer, Mr. Greenfield.
Marshal Key, back when you were Premier in South Vietnam, 1965 to 67, that coincided with the first big wave of anti-war feeling here in the United States, with the escalation of the war, with the increased press coverage in South Vietnam. The campuses began to come alive. The part of the Democratic Party began to turn away from the policy of their own President Lyndon Johnson. And much of that protest was based on the criticism that the government, which at the time you headed, was irredeemably corrupt, was no more free in any important sense than any other dictatorship, whatever the coloration, right or left, that in a sense we were fighting for a government that was not worth the effort in American lives and treasure. Now, you said earlier in this program that had South Vietnam had a clean, honest leadership in 1973 and 74, there might have been a chance to stave off what finally happened. But have you had the chance to think about whether a more honest government, a cleaner government, a more effective government in 1965 and 66 might have prevented the undermining of American support for the war in Vietnam?
Speaking of corruption, I think even now there is corruption everywhere, in every country in the world. And I think as long as the earth is round, you have people living on earth, you have corruption. And it takes you years and years to clean up the house. Speaking of my government when I was Premier, I stayed Premier for only 1 year and a half. I came as Premier when the country was in a big trouble. You had coup, military coup, and every days, every week. So the first achievement that I as Premier was the stability. And second, as your press report, that at that time I was very powerful. I have all kinds of authorities and decisions and power. And it's true. If I choose to stay as a dictator, I can stay. But nevertheless, 1 year and a half after that, I worked with other civilian groups to have the new constitution, and after that, the presidential election. And I not choose to run for the presidency. So I don't think that you can blame me as a dictator. Corruption.
You started off with a rather spectacular execution, as I remember, didn't you?
Yes.
The businessman.
Oh, yes, the businessman.
Latin, or whatever his name was.
And you know that he and his relative tried to pay me up to 200 millions?
How much is that in real money?
I don't know, but at that time, 200 millions.
He must have made a lot of profit.
You see, Mr. Buckley's quotation at the outset of the show, you ascribed in part the fall of the government in 75 to the fact that Mr. Thieu and his assistants were so corrupt that the North, in effect, deserved its victory. What I'm suggesting, I think, is that you've just described yourself as a man with very strong powers for a year and a half, the critical year and a half of the beginning of the end of United American support for the war in Vietnam. And it seems to me that if one is searching for responsibility, that perhaps one might begin with the actions of your government over that critical year and a half, which coincided, by the way, with the massive infusion of American arms and men.
But his answer was that he did everything to fit your specifications during those years. He stepped
Yes,
away
I'm-
from a power
But I'm suggesting that's just not
was
correct.
absolutely his if he had wanted to exercise
I mean,
it.
the desertion rate-
and executed corrupt
A
businessmen.
corrupt businessman, yes. It's sort of like the land reform programs that were beginning.
No, maybe I didn't achieve it 100%, because I don't think any man, even the smartest American man, if you came to power in that situation, and within a period of time, and you know, you heard about war law. Even people outside thought that, even now, think that I'm the most powerful. It was not true. Because I still have to deal with the war law, and even with Mr. Thieu, because Mr. Thieu, as the chairman of the council, acting as the chief of state, he signed all important paper. I remember one time I like to remove one corrupt general officers. I have to almost threaten to overthrow Mr. Thieu until he accept to sign the paper. Now I'm not trying to defend myself. I agree that we didn't achieve 100%. But the will were there, and we did start something.
Okay, I should say, Marshal Key, that there are those of us who believe that if South Vietnam was being run by the president of Switzerland in 1966, the opposition to which Ms. Greenfield refers would not have been significantly diminished. I
That is an internal matter between the Americans. There are those of us who would dispute that.
Mr. Sam Roberts is with the New York Daily News. Mr. Roberts?
Marshal Key, in South Vietnam, among the Vietnamese refugees here, among the Americans here, there are an awful lot of widows, an awful lot of orphans because of the Vietnam War. I don't know how many of them you've spoken to here since you've come, but what do you or what would you tell them? That their children, that their husbands, that their fathers died in vain, or that it was all worth it?
Well, one day I received a letter from a lady. Her husband, a captain pilot, was shot down and killed in North Vietnam. The reason she wrote me that letter, because when the Navy sent back to her his, baggage and so on, she found a purple scarf that I gave to this captain when I flew together with him in North Vietnam as a souvenir. So that's the reason the lady wrote me the letter. And she said that I'm very sad because I'm a widow now. I lost my husband. But I'm very proud of him because I know why he accepted to go to your country and accept to die for your country and your people. You think that the feeling of that lady can answer your question?
I don't know.
If not, well, my feeling is we will never forget their sacrifices, 50,000 and about almost 300 wounded American fighting men. Because I always fought side by side with them. But war never worked something, particularly when you are in this side. I mean, you are the loser.
And particularly when...
And war, my opinion, is not the game for the kids. War is a serious business because millions of people's lives are involved. So I think it's better asking yourself the question before you decide to commit yourself. Now, I think it's very easy to wait until the end, particularly when you lose it, to ask yourself the question. I cannot answer. All I can say is my gratitude our gratitude will never forget those sacrifices.
The letter you received from the widow was received before the collapse of the spring or since then?
Before the collapse.
Well, maybe her attitude has changed. Maybe she thought then that her husband's life had been contributed to a cause that would prove to be successful. But since it was not successful, might her feelings not reasonably have changed?
But then, Mr. Buckley, since I've been here 4 months now, even during my very first day in Camp Pendleton, I received more than 2,000 letters from all American people, from all the United States of America. And many of them have had their husband or son die in Vietnam. And they expressed to me the same feeling that lady wrote me before the end.
Mr. Mike Kramer's with New York Magazine. Mr. Kramer?
Mr. Ky, regardless of the outcome of the cause for which the United States and South Vietnam fought, at the early stages of the war, the American people were still probably prisoners of the Cold War rhetoric that said that we were there because of an extension of the domino theory. We weren't there to help you necessarily, we were there to prevent the spread of communism throughout Southeast Asia.
Prisoners is the same as believing in?
Yes. I was trying to just be a little cute.
Hit and run.
Thank you. Do you believe now that it was an internal struggle, that it was a civil war? Do you believe that the Khmer Rouge and the Viet Cong and the Pathet Lao are all one agency operating from Peking or Moscow? And do you believe that the domino theory works, that Thailand will fall next, and that indeed we should have been there to stop some great international communist conspiracy?
I think domino is just a word. But the fact is, after Vietnam, and I said it when I first arrived in Camp Pendleton, I said, next will be Laos, and it happened. And I have no doubt, next will be Thailand and other countries in Asia. But Thai are very smart people, because they see that kind of a threat from the North Vietnamese communists. And they know that only one country can prevent Chinese communists. So Thai are now establishing diplomatic relation with
The Soviet Union?
No, Peking. It's a good guarantee for the Thai people. Without that kind of a guarantee, Thai will be next.
I thought you said earlier that your experience with dealing with communists of any description is that they're not to be trusted. And that in fact, if the Chinese communists are dealing with the Thai government, then they're only doing so as a matter of accommodation now, and it will in no way save Thailand.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. But after Vietnam, the small country in Asia like Thailand and the Philippines and other, to be very frank, they don't trust anymore in America. So temporarily, they have to turn to someone, and that someone is, in my opinion, is Red Chinese, because Chinese communists, the first thing they don't want to see happen is the whole Vietnam unified under North Vietnamese communists, in other words, under Russian influence. 2 years ago, 2 years and a half, a Chinese communist agent come to me and said to me...
Officially or unofficially?
Oh gosh, unofficially.
And said to you that they feared this?
Well, he said to me that if you take over the control and declare Vietnam neutral, in other words, not side with either Russian or America, Chinese will support, because we have already trouble in the northern border with the Russian. We don't want to see our south flank occupied by Russian satellite. So Thai and the Philippines are now playing that game.
So you're
temporary.
a devotee of the theory that there was some great Sino-Soviet split, and that everything that's going on in Southeast Asia is just that game played out.
Yes, no doubt.
Well, is there any chance, or do you see any reason to believe, that the fall of your country and the fall of the countries surrounding your area in any way is reflective of the fact that the people in those countries prefer to live under a communist system than under the systems they live under now?
I frankly don't think so. People living in the communist country in Eastern Europe, for example, or even in Russia, you see many eminent Russian fled Soviet Union. So now you can imagine communist rule under the civilized country. And then compared to the Asian communists, particularly the North Vietnamese, I can say there is no comparison possible. In 1954, when the North Vietnamese first took control, with their so-called people trial, they raised a son against a father or mother, and they killed 500,000 people.
Why hasn't that happened in the South yet? Do you expect that there will be that bloodbath that we were warned about sooner or later?
There's no doubt, Mr. Bloodbath is not, I'm not very strong in American vocabulary, but what I understand, I don't think bloodbath is correct word, but let's think about a sort of elimination, quietly, without any publicity. Because now that what they need is a good publicity for them, a seat at the United Nations, a recognition by America, and who knows, a new aid program for South Vietnamese.
Thank you very much, Marshal Ky. Thank you, gentlemen of the panel. Thank you all.
Printed, bound transcript of this program, send $1 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. That's $1 to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. Production funding provided by public television stations, the Ford Foundation, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.